Okay, welcome everybody. This is, I think, our 12th meeting studying Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. And we went through a little more than half of the book, and then we had a two-session interlude looking at Debord's film, the last two sessions. And now we're going to return to the book, and we're starting with chapter 5, which is called Time and History. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So the epigram is from Shakespeare. "O gentlemen, the time of life is short, and if we live to tread on kings." First thesis: man, the negative being who is solely to the extent that he suppresses being, it's a Hegel quote, is identical with time. Man's appropriation of his own nature is at the same time his grasp of the development of the universe. Quote, "History is itself a real part of natural history, of the transformation of nature into man." That's from Marx. Conversely, this natural history exists effectively only through the process of human history, the only vantage point from which one can take in that historical totality, like the modern telescope whose power enables us to look back in time at the receding nebulas at the periphery of the universe. History has always existed, but not always in its historical form. The temporalization of humanity, brought about through the mediation of a society, amounts to a humanization of time. The unconscious movement of time becomes manifest and true within historical consciousness. Next thesis: true, though still hidden, historical movement begins with the slow and imperceptible development of the real nature of man, the quote, "nature that is born with human history out of the generative action of human society," unquote. But even when such a society has developed a technology and a language and is already a product of its own history, it is conscious only of a perpetual present. Knowledge is carried on only by the living, never going beyond the memory of the society's oldest members. Neither death nor procreation is understood as a law of time. Time remains motionless, like an enclosed space. When a more complex society finally becomes conscious of time, it tries to negate it, for it views time not as something that passes, but as something that returns. This static type of society organizes time in a cyclical manner, in accordance with its own direct experience of nature. Cyclical time is already dominant among the nomadic peoples because they find the same conditions repeated at each stage of their journey. As Hegel notes, quote, "The wandering of nomads is only formal because it is limited to uniform spaces," end quote. When a society settles in a particular location and gives space a content by developing distinctive areas within it, it finds itself confined within that locality. The periodic return to similar places, which was the nomads, now becomes the pure return of time to the same place, the people who had settled down, the repetition of a sequence of activities. The transition from pastoral nomadism to sedentary agriculture marks the end of an idle and contentless freedom and the beginning of labor. The agrarian mode of production, governed by the rhythm of the seasons, is the basis for fully developed cyclical time. Eternity is within this time. It is the return of the same here on earth. Myth is the unitary mental construct which guarantees that the cosmic order conforms with the order that this society has in fact already established within its frontiers. So let's pause there. Questions or comments? Yes, Mike, unmute yourself.
I I think every one of these theses could be written, a book could be written out of every one of them. But this particular observation is something that really uh, uh, enlightened me about the perception, that human perception and its relationship to time and history, and how it enlightened me about why it is that that it's so difficult to get people to progress to the point where they can abandon the myth histories that are part and parcel of a more a less developed shall we say, political economy. That in 138 he talks about peasants and the peasant mentality and how it's connected, still anchored within cyclical time, and that was like it just bowled me over because I thought about the Russian Revolution and how the most people in that country in the Tsarist Empire were peasants, and it makes so much sense now that they followed the little father like they had followed the little father before, and how deep the religious roots were. That's another reason why I like Chekhov, but I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Peter, unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is really interesting. It seems that what Debord is doing here is giving form to the prehistory of human society in a way. When I think about Marx in the manifesto, he's saying the history is recorded history is about class struggle, and what Debord here seems to be doing is trying to figure out, well, what happened beforehand, right? How do we perceive things? Our consciousness took a very long time to develop to see it's going to require class society to do that. But before that, we kind of just either don't understand time as being anything but just being out there, or as something that just kind of happens to us. I remember reading like Plato and the Greeks, just this idea that society is going to start at one point, collapse, and then kind of start over again, right? I mean, that's kind of what he's going through here. So it's really interesting just to kind of get this idea of, well, what comes before what Marx has to say, really. So
Yeah, thank you. Judy? You can unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, the first thing where he says history is itself a real part of natural history, of the transformation of nature into man. You know, I just saw this really interesting film set in India, and one of the themes was global warming, and they talk a lot about how species are evolving to adapt, and everything on Earth is connected through the air. We're all affected by the Earth and the changes in the Earth. And I was wondering if that was kind of what he was talking about, that we are kind of connected to the universe, and that we have to kind of make our lives in that framework somehow. Did you disappear? Or is that not what he, I mean, it seemed kind of, prescient in a way to what he was saying, even though this was written like a long time before global warming was an issue.
Right.
But that we are connected, that we do have all living things are connected to each other, whether
Yeah.
they think they are or not.
Yeah. Well, Debord is just quoting Marx. So Debord was not being prescient. Marx is being prescient more than 100 years earlier. But the same idea, yeah, is how human history, what we call history, is usually the history of humans, is what we think of it. We don't, and then when we go back to dinosaurs or something like that, we call that prehistory. And it's understandably distinguished there because, of course, the stuff that happened before humanity was there, to us doesn't mean very much, except just sort of out of curiosity, like, well, what, how did we get here or something? But also, as far as we can tell, it doesn't have some of the qualities of human history, which have to do with a certain kind of consciousness and a certain sense of time and so on. As far as we know, other species, I mean, maybe there's some exceptions, with whales or something, but we don't really know. Other species are more or less living in the present, and they may not even know, like they mate, but they very well may not know what's what that does. And then they have kids and they don't know where that comes from, but they just have sort of instinctual reactions to them. Anyway, that kind of thing. With humanity, you have more of this historical culture. So those are those two big differences. But he's saying they're still connected with each other. You can't just, cut one off from the other. And in the obvious way that if nature goes down the tubes, so do we. Ed Stress?
Yeah, hi. I got two things. It's a unitary mental construct. By unitary, there he means there's only one kind. This is the end of 127. Eternity within time is the return of the same here on earth. Myth is the unitary mental construct which guarantees the cosmic order conforms to the order that society has in fact already established within its frontiers. Unitary there, I guess, means there's only one construct. There's not more than one. Is that right? I don't know.
Well, I think it would mean that, but I think also that it's like holistic. It's a thing.
Hmm.
It's not that there's not two things or three things, but whatever it is, it's sort of a overall
It's a
thing.
thing.
Like when we say the universe, it means one,
Yeah, yeah. And
So
then, and then he also seems to be saying, I mean, I'm used to history being the stuff that's been written down, but when he says history's there before we're able to know that it's history, it sounds like he's talking about that things happen. I mean, that things happen is also history. The
yeah,
Second World War happened, regardless if we write it down or not. That's history.
that's right. So obviously, things are happening with earlier societies uh, and so on. And for that matter, they're happening with chimpanzees or antelopes or various other things. But we can say sort of human things are happening with these early humanoid
Before,
types,
before,
but
before
they don't write them down. So at most they can sort of remember that their grandfather said such and such, or their grandmother warned against eating that plant or something.
I got the impression he was talking about regardless of whether there was memory
Yeah.
history. E-
So
even before letters, just or memory, that stuff happened, whether you got it
Hello?
written down or
sure,
not.
Manny?
Yeah, okay.
sure.
Oh, hi. Hey, I'm doing my book group on
Okay,
Facebook.
thanks.
Okay. So let's proceed here. Um, I'll mute everybody again just for a moment. So the next thesis, 128, the social appropriation of time and the production of man by human labor develop within a society divided into classes. The power that establishes itself above the poverty of the society of cyclical time, the class that organizes this social labor and appropriates its limited surplus value, simultaneously appropriates the temporal surplus value resulting from its organization of social time. It alone possesses the irreversible time of living. Maybe I'll stop there for a second. You know, economically, when we say that a ruler, a ruling class is appropriating something, it's like various people in the society are working or producing things, gathering food or whatever. And some of that's used for their own survival to carry on. And some of the excess is the surplus value, what's left over. And in class societies, even at a primitive level, that surplus tends to go to a certain stratum of people who have managed to, whether consciously or not, to sort of worm their way into this special category. Like they could be the priests or the military leaders or the kings or whatever. And so, and then out of that surplus, they can make that surplus do more things, and then they can get where there's an extreme difference, like an emperor of Persia compared with a peasant at the bottom or something. Debord is making an analogy here to say that they are doing the same thing with time. Like the people at the bottom, which is the vast majority of people, are um, still in this cyclical time. They're just sort of going around in a circle, and as far as they can tell, it's always been that way, and it always will be that way. So nothing much is happening except that you're just going through these different repeating phases. But the people at the top who suddenly relatively suddenly, find themselves with some leisure, you might say, and some extra power because they control these other people, they can decide what we're going to do with this surplus and so on. They end up, as we have in the later part of this thesis, having themselves a different kind of time that the other people don't have. It's a time of adventure and of war, of conflict and battle. The peasants, that doesn't mean anything. They have nothing to do with that, except that they could be drafted to fight in a war or something, or forced to build something that the rulers want built. So that's what he's talking about in the remainder of this thing. The wealth that can only be concentrated in the hands of the rulers and spent in extravagant festivities. What are they going to do with these leisures? Well, they'll have a big feast or something. Amounts to a squandering of historical time at the surface of a society. The owners of this historical surplus value are the only ones in a position to know and enjoy or experience real events. Separated from the collective organization of time associated with the repetitive production at the base of social life, this historical time flows independently above its own static community, the community that's just going around in a circle. This is the time of adventure and war, the time in which the masters of cyclical society pursue their personal histories. It is also the time that emerges in the clashes with foreign communities that disrupt the unchanging social order. History thus arises as something alien to people, as something they never sought and from which they had thought themselves protected in their nice little circle. But it also revives the negative human restlessness that had been at the very origin of this whole temporarily dormant development. Next thesis, in itself, cyclical time is a time without conflict. So this is kind of repeating what the previous one is saying. That's in itself, but conflict emerges even in this infancy of time as history first struggles to become history in the practical activity of the masters. This history creates a surface irreversibility. Its movement constitutes the very time it uses up within the inexhaustible time of cyclical society. Next one, static societies, and he's quoting this here because I think this is an anthropological term or something that for this kind of society that seemingly doesn't move, that just kind of goes around in a perpetual circle. It's our societies that have reduced their historical movement to a minimum, that have managed to maintain their internal conflicts and their conflicts with the natural and human environment in a constant equilibrium. Although the extraordinary, and this is, when we read this, let's think back over those pre-literate society texts that we just recently went through. And think of, we had a number of different kind of cultures there. We had cultures that were, you know, sort of magical or kind of skeptical or sort of semi-agricultural or hunting and gathering or all kinds of different things there. But one thing that we saw is that they're living under difficult, primitive circumstances, but they arrived out of they managed to deal with it. You know, like when we saw those Bushmen, you know, like just imagine how could people just survive under those conditions? But they managed to do that, and they sort of partially evolve, although it's mostly cultural, may even have a little bit of physical evolution to, you know, have a better sense of smell or a keener sense of how you do this or that, so that you would need to be a hunter, for example. And if they have potential conflicts in their little cyclical societies, they evolve ways to deal with them by saying, no, no, you don't do that. So that's taboo. That doesn't work. Don't do that. If you do that, you'll be kicked out, you know. So they have all these little rules and habits, customs, and all this. So Debord is saying this is an amazing wealth of different things, but it's within a very limited thing. He says, although the extraordinary diversity of the institutions established for this purpose, i.e., to have an equilibrium of all these things, bears eloquent testimony to the flexibility of human nature's self-creation. This diversity is apparent only to the external observer, the ethnologist who looks back from the vantage point of historical time. I mean, if you went back in earlier periods and went to some tribe, they would have only the dimmest notion of the amount of variety over the earth. They might say, oh, this neighboring group over there is kind of weird because they do this thing differently. And they would have a little bit of sense of that. And they would say, well, that's what makes us the people, and they are the weirdos or something, you know, that you got to watch out when you're dealing with them. So, you know, they assumed that what they were doing is just, that's it. You know, it's not supposed to change. In reality, it does change, but it changes so gradually that they think it's been that way for 1,000 years, even if it hasn't. So in each of these societies, a definitive organizational structure has eliminated any possibility of change. the total conformism of their social practices, with which all human possibilities are identified for all time, has no external limit but the fear of falling back into a formless animal condition. The members of these societies remain human at the price of always remaining the same. So again, this is, we can say, well, a lot of different variety of types of living, things that we could still pick up on and relate to, or things that we could learn from even. But if we look at it from a larger point of view, it's also definitely very constricting. If you're in that kind of society, there's no vision of making things better. It's just like, this is how it's done. Maybe that's oversimplifying a little bit, but not very much. Primarily it's like, no, we got to do this because our forefathers said that was how it was supposed to be done. So, but now when we start getting these changes, here's what he's dealing with the emergence of political power, which seems to be associated with the last great technological revolutions, such as iron smelting, at the threshold of a period that would experience no further major upheavals until the rise of modern industry. At that time, kinship ties begin to dissolve. They were the things that really, the glue that held these tribal societies together. The succession of generations within a natural, purely cyclical time begins to be replaced, it's not all of a sudden, by a linear succession of powers and events. This irreversible time is the time of those who rule, and the dynasty is its first unit of measurement. Think again of these tribal societies. There's usually not a sense like what we think of as a dynasty or something, like, oh, it was like this for 500 years, and then 100 years ago, somebody came in and instituted some sort of change, and now we're doing it that new way. They don't say that. Whatever way they're doing, they say, oh, that's how it's always been. The gods instituted that. If you don't do that, you're going to really come to a bad end. And, they may say that even though their great grandfathers were doing something differently. They don't know that they were doing something differently. It was sort of a gradual change. And little by little, maybe some little new technological thing came in, like a better way of making a bow and arrow or something, and that leads to this or that, or as he mentions, clashes with foreign communities. The same thing. Maybe you make a better bow and arrow, and then you end up dominating your neighbor and driving them off, and then you've got room to expand. So some changes can come in that are a little more visibly changing, like, oh, that it wasn't like that when my grandfather was around, suddenly we're in a new situation and we had to invent some new thing. They'll still go back and they'll consult some shaman or something, or well, how shall we deal with this? Well, I don't know. And they'll kind of, wing it and come up with something new. And then they say, okay, that's how it's got to be. So anyway, what's happening here is that irreversible time is creeping in little by little, even though most of the stuff is still going around in a circle. This irreversible time is the time of those who rule, and the dynasty is its first unit of measurement. Writing is the ruler's weapon. That comes in, of course, sometime later. There were rulers before there was writing, but properly speaking, when we're getting to the dynasty level and all that. In writing, language attains its complete independence as a mediation between consciousnesses. But this independence coincides with the general independence of separate power, the mediation that shapes society. With writing, there appears a consciousness that is no longer carried and transmitted directly among the living. An impersonal memory, the memory of the administration of society. Quote, writings are the thoughts of the state. Archives are its memory, unquote. That's Novalis. Novalis was a romantic philosopher and poet of the late 18th century, maybe extended into the 19th century, like a little before Hegel and Goethe and those people. So I think we can, let's see, do we want to? Okay, we'll go through one more thesis here. So we're now talking about this thing that's developing on the surface of society while the same old stuff is continually going on underneath among the majority of the population. And this thing on the surface is the rulers, their adventures, their wars, their conflicts, including internal conflicts. And their adventures mean that one thing happens and maybe somebody defeats somebody else. Well, that makes a change. Suddenly that family there is wiped out and this other family comes in and its history starts again. It's like a new dynasty or a new fashion among the existing dynasty or something. So this is what we're talking about here. The chronicle is the expression of the irreversible time of power. A chronicle, if you think, if you go back in history, I'm not sure if everybody even knows what a chronicle is. It means there's an accounting of time, of what happened. Like it would be as if we were saying, okay, it's 1967, and during this year, so and so died, and there was a new president elected, and there was a war over here, and da, da, da. Then in 1968, this happened. And then in 1969, this happened. So you get this series of things, which is not like you have in the earlier primitive societies. They may have that sort of short-term memory where they remember the previous generation had this person in it or something, or some interesting thing happened. But they don't think of it as like this kind of adventurous journey that is changing things. It also serves to inspire the chronicle, namely, the continued progression of that time by recording the past out of which it has developed. Since this orientation of time tends to collapse with the fall of each particular power and would otherwise sink back into the indifferent oblivion of cyclical time, parenthesis, the only time known to the peasant masses, who, during the rise and fall of all the empires and their chronologies, never change, end parenthesis. It's a very elegant little thing there. Just again, as Mike said, you could make a book out of that. And in fact, people have written many books just about that, about peasant societies or about primitive societies, and how they have a different sense of time or blah, blah, blah. And how they relate when some newfangled thing comes in, like a new dynasty or a new technology or something. So he's saying here that the chronicle doesn't just record this time, but it actually affects this time. It's like a vicious, a self moving thing. The chronicle, by writing down this stuff, this encourages the stuff to continue. Because the new ruler can read the chronicle and say, oh, 100 years ago, this ruler did this. This ruler did that, and it didn't work out well. I better learn from that. And so if you have a sense that this has been going on for hundreds of years, then of course you assume, well, it's going to keep going on and keep changing for the next hundreds of years, instead of just sort of starting back from square one when some, like some dynasty is defeated. So the owners of history, that's these rulers, have given time a direction which is also a meaning. In French, this is like sort of like a pun, because the term sens, sens, is also means a direction as well as a sense. Um, but this history develops and perish. Let me just see how he does that. It's 132. Les possesseurs de l'histoire ont mis dans le temps un sens, colon, une direction, which is also, so he's saying it's given them a sense, a sens, and then he elaborates a direction that is also a meaning. So it's easier for us in English to just do that, kind of divide them up like I did. But this history develops and perishes separately, leaving the underlying society unchanged, because it remains separate from the common reality. This is why we tend to reduce the history of Oriental empires to a history of religions. Oh, first there was Hinduism, and then Buddhism, and then Manichaeism, and Christianity, and then Islam, and the chronologies that have fallen to ruins have left nothing but the seemingly independent history of the illusions that veiled them, the religions. The masters who used the protection of myth to make history their private property did so first of all in the realm of illusion. In China and Egypt, for example, ancient China and Egypt, they long held a monopoly on the immortality of the soul. If you remember the pyramid kind of stuff, the pharaohs were buried there, and the idea that they would be immortal, but the ordinary people weren't immortal. And it was similar idea in China. They long held a monopoly on the immortality of the soul, and their earliest officially recognized dynasties were nothing but imaginary reconstructions of the past. But this illusory ownership by the masters was the only ownership then possible, both of the common history and of their own history. As their real historical power expanded, this illusory mythical ownership became increasingly vulgarized. Popularized, it extended to the low common person, not just the kings. All these consequences flowed from the simple fact that as the masters played the role of mythically guaranteeing the permanence of cyclical time, as in the seasonal rites performed by the Chinese emperors, they themselves achieved a relative liberation from cyclical time. Okay, let's pause there. Judy, unmute yourself. There you go.
I think that was an old hand. I don't have anything to say right now.
Okay. Okay. Kirsty, unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm finding this really fascinating, and it's really kind of making me feel like now I kind of understand what he's been talking about throughout all these readings of the difference between surviving, which is what all of us are doing in this spectacular society, and living. And I think, and this also, I think someone previously mentioned just this whole really making a point of like how what we take for granted is just basic physical reality, like time and space are actually, constructed and related to power and class and so on. But yeah, I was really taken by what he was saying, kind of like, where is it in 128, like the owners of this historical surplus value are the only ones in a position to know and enjoy real events. So it's like when this irreversible time splits off, then there's this possibility of actually living, but it's only for the elite who are dominating everyone else. I think later he says about the Greeks, something I was really taken by, like the only people who actually lived are the people who didn't work.
Right, right.
Is great. But so it's sort of, yeah, sort of like a moment that we can look to of like, well, this is the possibility of what society could be. But then I'm also feeling about this notion of cyclical. I mean, and I know he has to really concentrate everything down into these incredibly terse things, so it can't really express the variety of human experience. But just to mention about these so-called static societies, that many of them were quite complex, and they did change quite a lot. That's how they survived. And they had their own chronicles, like the sort of a lot of the Native American Plains people had their yearly thing that they made of what had happened. But what was I going to say? Yeah, that they had, at least, again, looking back from our current era of being about to destroy ourselves and the planet and so on, they had sort of, many societies had some kind of social mechanism they had come up with to deal with people who would have been like the Elon Musk of the tribe, or somebody who was trying to somehow change things so that they would get more
Right.
than everybody else was getting, or than what was their due based on their position and so on. And they had some, and it worked. I mean, some of these societies lasted for thousands of
Yeah.
years, which is something we could, think about some more at this
Yeah,
point
it's
in time.
again, as generally here, this is not really or about putting things down or
Right, right.
disdaining this or something. It's like from our angle, like what we want, we're looking back. He's talking about us looking back at, we've got a different vantage point on that. It's like what is interesting for us of that past, those people are dead. You know, uh, it's not, it doesn't exist anymore. But we can look at that and we can pick out, but possibly by oversimplifying, we can pick out certain things and think, now there's something that's kind of interesting. There's a certain mastery there, for example, and as you were pointing out, that we can see, okay, that shows difference between living and surviving, blah, blah, blah. At the same time, you could also disdain those people who are having those adventures because they're, I mean, in a different perspective, they're the bad guys who are, now we find ourselves confronted with their later incarnations. But at the same time, it would be ridiculous to just sort of say, well, that's bad. And so now the good guys are the people at the bottom. Well, the people at the bottom, in a lot of ways, this is not going to cut it. They are just riddled with ignorances and superstitions and limits and pettinesses and all this kind of thing. But we can look at certain angles and say, well, yes, this functions this way, but now in a different context, we make this adjustment. But we can take inspiration like Debord did, like when he comes to Greece, for example, or the medieval or Renaissance Italian cities, or another thing that he thinks is kind of interesting. He could look at that and say, this, you know, not that it's exactly an inspiration or something like that, but it's or a model, but it's giving us some sense of possibilities. Here's what somebody does when they're not being told what to do. And of course, a lot of the time, what they do is they make war or they plot to get more power or something like that. But they also do other interesting things in the arts and religions and sciences and this and other kind of human community things. And we can look at that and kind of see, well, that aspect of it we could be adapted to our use, whereas this other thing is just forget it, we want to go beyond that. So the simplicity you're talking about is just you have to have that if to get anywhere when you're talking, you have to come up with a concept that can be useful. And then at a certain point, you'll have to tear that concept apart into other concepts because it's rigidified or, something like that. So, thank you. I'd like to get Zach first, and then I'll come back to you, Mike. Zach?
Yeah, I may be the only person having this problem. I've always found this chapter and the following section, this whole discussion of time, the most difficult and obscure portion of the book. And I think my problem is I don't understand why Debord feels a need to create a philosophy of time or develop a philosophy of time. I don't understand how this relates to the rest of the Situationist project. And maybe he's in a dialogue with Hegel, which I'm not getting because I'm not terribly knowledgeable about Hegel. But every time I've read these sections several times, and I just don't quite understand why he feels the need to go there. And I guess I find I have a lot of trouble sort of understanding what argument, the overall argument that he's trying to make, where this is supposed to go. And maybe I should just listen to the rest of the next 2 or 3 days and next 2 or 3 sessions and see what people have to say, and I'll learn something.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, time is kind of a tricky thing, obviously, like, to talk about. It's got paradoxes and it's a rather abstract thing. But I mean, try to think, how can we talk about anything without addressing this? I mean, it is a pretty big deal if some people, for example, don't think that time develops. It just goes around in a circle, and other people in other societies think, oh no, it moves from point A to point B. It moves from up low to high, or however they want to envision it. But that's a different thing. So in itself, that might not, I mean, Debord's aim here always is our liberation as individuals and as a society, a global society. So that's the only point. So he's saying if we do this in a way, I mean, we don't have to, everybody doesn't have to understand Hegel or something like this, but we are in time. I mean, we can't just ignore it and say, oh, well, everybody knows Tuesday comes after Monday or something like that. What are you talking about? Or some things are faster than other things. If we have a sense of society, I mean, part of our society problems now, you could look at it in a way, is that a very large number of people have not the dimmest idea of these kind of things. They do think that things have not changed, or that things constantly change in such a meaningless thing that we have no control over it, so forget it. It's just whatever is the latest thing. I mean, there's a generation, of younger people now, again, to oversimplify, who hardly has any sense of history. I mean, when you talk about World War II, for some people, it's almost, you could just as well be talking about Shakespeare's era or something. They just think that it's just some weird thing in the past and it's all irrelevant now because we've got so many new inventions and stuff, and that's just, at most the old fuddy-duddies are reminiscing about that or something. And if you have that kind of sense, when it comes to saying, what are we going to do with our lives, with this society? And they say, well, I don't know, so-and-so said this, maybe I'll vote for him or something. They're just completely unoriented. So I'm taking a very simplistic thing here, like just that history and time have some meaning. And then there are subtler things, like the things that we've just gone through here the last few minutes, things like the difference between cyclical and irreversible time, the time that goes forward and you can't go back. That's a whole different thing. And that those things interlac, clash with each other in different ways, which we're going to about get into when we get into Greece and the monotheistic religions and blah, 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 different things. Like each of them has a sort of different sense of time. And if we don't look into that a little bit, we may not know, well, what's going on in the Middle Ages? How is Rome different from Greece? There were differences there. Well, partly it was a matter of, if we, and when by taking this whole chapter on time, he's focusing us on that thing. It would be easier to focus on geography, which he does in the following chapter. We can have spatial things, and people are isolated because they're far away, or they're isolated and by the spectacle or something like this. But time is a little trickier to deal with. And so that's why, you don't do this and immediately say, oh, well, of course, yeah, that's how it is. It's tricky. And Debord personally, I might add, when you can see in some of his films and some of his other writings, he will say something like, the sense of time has been my dominant, passion or concern or something like that. And it's kind of a strange thing to say, maybe. I mean, when I read that, I thought, well, what does he mean by that? But in other words, he's talking about something he knows something about or has experienced, that there's something very melancholy about time, or that there's something very, time doesn't allow you to cheat. If you make a mistake that is a fatal mistake, you're dead. And you can't go back. It's not cyclical. You walked across the street and you weren't looking, and bam, there you are. And then other people can be missing you. Oh, if only he was back here, or if only he hadn't done this or something, So this is common sense, but a lot of people do things in a non-commonsensical way. They're not really looking at that. So that's one thing that Debord is very aware of, just on a personal level. But he's also aware that we're in this like fish in water. And so it's hard for us to understand it. And like, if you tried to explain to a fish what water was, the fish would not know what you were talking about. Unless maybe you took it out of the water and then say, you want that? Yes. But they don't really know what the water is. It's just where they live. And a bird is, there's some Zen statements about a bird flying in the air doesn't know what air is. I mean, it sort of knows it's there, but you say, what is air? Well, that's just what is. Well, we're in time like that, among other things. We live in other things, but because we're in that time, it's interesting and useful, potentially, to understand how those different kinds of time evolve from one another or conflict with one another. And he ends up near the end of, is it this chapter or the following chapter, one of these chapters, where he says there's this global time that's unified in a way that's would be completely incomprehensible to a primitive society. And that global thing is very alienated kind of thing. But we need to go there first. We have this sort of objective time, and then he envisions a free society would have federated times. It's a mind-blowing concept. It's like, okay, we've got the idea, there's cyclical time, there's this, and there's the, different sorts of ways that you could rhythm your life, so to speak. And he's envisaging in one sentence, just this little hint, like imagining societies all over the place with all sorts of various things, and they federate times. I've got my own time here that I've created or set up, but my time and your time, we can federate them. And that means we can mutually join them together to some central time or something like that, where we can say, well, that's such and such of global time or something. But to have the sense of societies where it's not like, oh no, we're all at this doing the same. We're all in millions of different times that we've created to organize our lives. And yet it's also objectively doable because we federate, so it's not like there's some boss saying everybody has to be on the same time. But if we want to arrange a rendezvous, then we say, oh, we'll go over there. Oh, translate that into global time. It's blah. And then we know what that is. But it's a kind of different, I don't know if I'm making this very clear or not.
Yeah, I mean, this is also stuff that Louis Mumford went into at some length. And I'm sure that Debord was familiar with
Yeah,
Mumford.
absolutely. Yeah, he admired Mumford. In fact, Debord's notes he saved his notes and they're being published. And so he has there's notes on Marx and Hegel and notes on, military strategy and this. And there's notes on poetry, etc. That's the name of one of the volumes. And he put Mumford in with the poets. So you've got Shakespeare and Homer and so on, and Mumford was categorized there. So I don't know how thorough, but some of Mumford was translated into French.
Yeah, he's familiar with it.
Yeah, he's certainly, and at the very, when we get into the geography chapter, he does quote Mumford approvingly in several places. All right, we better move on here, but thanks for bringing that up. Mike. Oh, did I click Peter?
Hey, I got it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask a question about whether he probably was, because Debord was French and so was Bataille, and I was wondering if he had noted or anything Bataille's work called The Accursed Share, because
Oh, absolutely.
book,
absolutely.
yeah. Okay.
That stuff was kind of common. I mean, bear in mind, Debord knew everything about the surrealists. So stuff like Bataille is something like, I'm sure he probably read 10 volumes of Bataille or so. I mean, he might not have even liked Bataille, but that would have been one of the things that would have been in discussion.
Right.
Yeah. So
because
for sure,
in that book, The Accursed Share, Bataille connects the possession of wealth by the ruling class to the to the sort of cyclical history and the religions that made the majority of people who were producing the wealth, their share of free time was spent in like doing sacrifices or being sacrificed or something like this. So I thought that was. Oh, that one other thing is that, that it occurred to me is that there used to be I think a slogan called that was for the end of prehistory. I think that was one of the Situationist things that they were scrawling on the walls in '68, and it connects to this particular chapter 5 because because it seems that the Sit saw us as being in a sense in prehistory
Yeah,
now.
yeah, we're in prehistory.
Right, because we
Marx and
don't.
Engels say that when we have the kind of revolution we're talking about, then we will enter real history. That is not
Right.
sort of this farcical thing where we're doing stuff, but we're kind of don't know what we're doing, and
Right. Yeah. I think the distinction was the distinction that I know of from reading Marx is this distinction between a political revolution and a social
yeah,
revolution. In that a political revolution is where you change ruling classes or let's say dynasties,
right,
and a social revolution which is made by the immense majority of people for themselves.
exactly. Which inevitably changes a lot more fundamental things since there. Peter.
Yeah, I guess to Zach's point, these are complicated chapters. I wonder, but they've always been fascinating to me. Like, how much did Debord see these as kind of a crux of his work here? Because it seems like they're really, really important from what I've been reading. Did he talk about these chapters in terms of being important to the spectacle when if he wrote about it later? I guess I'm curious because it seems really the way that why he places it here seems important.
Well, I think everything he put in this book is important. He worked on this, I don't know, I think 2 or 3 years or something. I think maybe the final thing was just a few months, but he had been kind of preparing this for the years before. And I'm sure that if you had his notes, it would have been thousands of pages of stuff. Not that he was even verbose, but I think he was just constant. When he read stuff, he would copy out a paragraph of, something that he thought was interesting and put it in here with a little note saying for such and such. And that might be about time or something. So, he would have these various themes kind of there. And when something struck him, by the fluency of the language or the interesting insight or something like that. And then when he got around to that later, he might have a folder of stuff that was on time. And he goes, I mean, I don't know, I'm just guessing. He goes there and kind of looks through. And meanwhile, he's been sort of maturing. What do I think about this time? Can I combine these 5 notes into one concept? And put that in one sentence of and then he does that and goes on and on and on. And so when he gets down to the final book, I mean, even as late as 1967, when Vanegum's book, he had seen already, although it wasn't published yet. And then he told Vanegum, I'm doing this thing, which is organized very differently than yours, much more concise and dry. And so, and it's in 12 chapters. So this is fairly late in there. But you can see, okay, he has some he has one chapter like about a chapter about how would one write a book such as this. Well, that didn't end up being a chapter in there, but in other words, at some point he had thought, well, that might be an interesting chapter to in the book to say, how does one write such unusual book, you know, like, so in the actual book that will get down in just 2 or 3 sentences. Like, to critique the spectacle, it is necessary in a certain sense to speak the language of the spectacle, because yeah, you know, and he'll bring in little things like that, but it's done in a kind of objective and personal way. But so all this stuff in time, there's no fluff in there. You can say every single thesis he decided, you know, this deserves to be a thesis here. There were many other things that only deserved to be half of a sentence in another thesis when he boiled them down.
Yeah, it's really fast. I guess the only other point I wanted to make was it's really fascinating. I like the line when he talks about temporal surplus value in 128. I really think that's interesting because I was thinking about this a bit, and really when Marx is talking about surplus value, he's talking about time. It's just a different kind of time. And so what Debord is really saying here is that control of time really, you know, Marx is going to talk about surplus, but it's really about like control of time is really control of human society, of freedom in some way. And at first the rulers get it, they get control of time. And so he's talking about how do we work, I think, towards all of us having some control. Like I think you're talking about the federated time eventually is like the most freedom. It's really, really interesting how he does it.
Thank you. Ed.
Hi, I agree with all of us have been lauding this selection in this particular chapter. I'm, you know, as a sort of science person, I at first really choked on it, but then I understood better and better the human time, and I'm thinking of the time of the peasants, and I can see that it is eternal in a way, that it's cyclic, but it's hard still because it is time. It takes a certain amount of time to boil an egg. I don't think that's what he means. Um, but I got a big clue when I went to one of these lovely places in Berkeley and sat in this garden and the birds were going around, and I was thinking how much. Oh, and the other thing is, before I get to that, this I have to do this first. That I'm thinking about the ruling class or their agents uh, ha, are interested in making progress, while the laborers are constrained to make product, and that the product was cyclic. But you don't have to worry. You have a schedule, except for this really unscheduled work we have today, which is disastrous. So then I'm going to these places for vacation, a little mini vacation, and I'm realizing that the vacations I seek, I'm sitting there and the birds are there and the lake is there. And I'm realizing I'm just really enjoying this because and the word came to me, timeless. And, and this is before we started this chapter. So I get it on an emotional level. And then I'm thinking, what do I mean? Why is it so pleasurable? Because it's it's saving me from making progress. Because in what I do, I'm trying to make progress. And I don't have to do that when I was in the garden. I don't know.
Sometimes making progress is great fun, and other times it's necessary. So it's not. We
The
don't want
fact of it is,
to. We don't want to get.
having to make progress, having to make it.
Well, first of all, what's called progress, is just like we're progressing to the destruction of the planet. What is that? I mean, so it's not as if uh, questioning the current society is not questioning progress. There isn't any progress being made.
Right.
So that's not the problem. Would that there were some progress being made. I mean, and if we can say, well, yeah, there is some progress in the sense that, sometimes revolutions happen or something like this.
But doesn't he identify, doesn't he say that what progress is like the changing of the guard from one family to the other? I mean,
He doesn't use the word progress in
oh,
that sense.
what is he calling that?
Well, it's just, I mean, there can be a change from
History.
one ruler to another or
Yes.
something like that.
I thought he did say that the work of history was that people are these guys are killing
Well,
the
they're moving forward, so
Yeah.
to speak. Something is
Yeah.
appearing, being created that wasn't there yesterday. And it's not just a thing that happens every year and goes around in a circle. A new invention is made, and that invention's still around a year later. And that invention is causing other changes to take place, and it's inspiring other things. The invention may be a better way to kill people or something in war, but another invention may be, for better healthcare or something like that. All sorts of different things can be going on. The point is there's constant innovation, and the problem is that the innovations in our society are under the control of the masters. So naturally, other things being equal, they're going to approve funding for the ones that will come up with something more profitable, and they're not going to approve funding for something that makes people more intelligent, like better education or something, unless they need certain kinds of education to make these products that are more profitable, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So let's move on here.
Am I on the right track about the timelessness of
Timeless, that's great. Sure. I mean, that's what we enjoy when we sit in a park and listen to birds, is that we're not worrying about getting from point A to point B. We're just sitting there and enjoying it. So that's great. That's somewhat like meditation or something like that. That's a whole different thing. Debord is not talking about that when he talks about cyclical or non-cyclical
But
time.
is this what he means by peasant time? I don't, maybe not.
No, that's not what he means by
What does he mean by
time.
peasant time? I don't get
It
it.
means that for a peasant, 1 year is like the next.
Yeah, but 1 week is not like the next.
Well, of course, things change. That's why the cycle is that it gets hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and the leaves fall in the
How
fall.
is that different than the larger time scale of emperors changing?
Of what?
Emperors changing. The larger
Well,
time.
yeah, but he's saying that for the peasants,
Yeah.
an emperor can come and go, and it pretty much doesn't make any difference.
No, you're saying things change week to week for the
Hey,
peasant, but what about the grand scale? They change century to century for the rulers. I mean, how is the time different?
Well, for the peasants, they're not even conscious for the most part of centuries.
No, I'm not.
They don't read books about the
I'm saying,
history.
I'm saying the century is to the emperor as the week is to the peasant.
Well, no, don't. That's
No, I'm just trying to see how it isn't because you're saying it isn't. You're saying time's different for the peasant.
time is different because the person at the top can say, aha, I can plan to invade that neighboring community. And if I do that, then if I succeed, blah, 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 if I fail to, the peasant doesn't have that option. The peasant is just working pretty much full time with a few little breaks like for festivals and stuff like that. And
But I think that's about power, not time.
no, that's about time because the ruler can affect something that's going to change next year. The peasant can't. As far as the peasant's concerned, they're doing the same thing year after year.
Unless they,
When the ruler comes in, it's a different thing because it's my family that's in power now. And if I want to keep in power, I want to kill off that neighboring the rival family, and I want to invade the neighboring people there, and I want to support those priests that are doing the good job of keeping the peasants ignorant, and all these things. And meanwhile, if I have some spare time, well, we'll have a great festival, or I'll go out lion hunting or something. That was one of the things that the Persian emperors like to do.
So the causality creates time.
Well, I don't know about
Well,
causality.
the causality from the emperor down to the peasant, that creates the flow of time. I
Well,
guess what you're saying. I don't know.
Um, I'd like to move on here so we can, I'm not, so we had those chronologies, or chronicles rather, and this stuff on the surface. Now starting at 133, the dry, unexplained chronology, which was those kind of things, chronicles, that a deified authority offered to its subjects, namely, last year was this king, and now I'm this king, and da, da, da. That's all you need to know, folks, who were supposed to accept it as the earthly fulfillment of mythic commandments, like the reason I'm here is that I was appointed to be the king by God so and so, or whatever. This was destined to be transcended and transformed into conscious history. This other stuff was not conscious history. It's just a list of stuff that happened with the few people who were making history. But for this to happen, sizable groups of people had to have experienced real participation in history, not just a few people. By sizable, I mean, like hundreds or thousands of people as a group, not just a little clique. Out of this practical communication between those who have recognized each other as possessors of a unique present, who have experienced a qualitative richness of events in their own activity, and who are at home in their own era, arises the general language of historical communication. Those for whom irreversible time truly exists discover in it both the memorable and the threat of oblivion, wiping out the memories. Quote, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here presents the results of his researches, so that time will not abolish the deeds of men, unquote. Next thesis, examining history amounts to examining the nature of power. Like these chronicles never examined the nature of power. They just said the king had a child, and that new king was crowned 10 years later. And, there was nothing that said, why is that person the king? How did they get there? How does it work? How does this system? Never anything like that. The Chronicle just says, by the order of the king, I'm reporting that this year this happened. Next year this, Greece, namely ancient Greece, like 5th century BC, was the moment when power and changes in power were first debated and understood. And this really isn't an exaggeration. There was not much of, if you look at other societies, again, they were pretty much all like these empires in which nobody would have dared to say, why is that person the king and not me? You get to be tortured to death for that. Greece was a democracy of the masters of society. That just sums it up perfectly. It was the first democracy, really, if you don't count that there were in primitive tribes, there was probably a sort of democracy, but that's not the level we're talking about. This was a real democracy where hundreds of people would in public debate, what are we going to do about this? What kind of laws do we want? Are we going to execute this person who did that, or are we going to free him? Are we going to go to war with our neighboring people there? How many votes for? First of all, we're going to argue for both sides, and then after, and so on. And that's what the Greeks did. It was a democracy of the masters of society, a total contrast to the despotic state, where power settles accounts only with itself, within the impenetrable obscurity of its inner sanctum, by means of palace revolutions, which are beyond the pale of discussion whether they fail or succeed. In other words, if you're in something like, and we can remember this from Herodotus, if you're in a situation where the early Persians were, who have just conquered the Medes, and so that now Persia is in control, and they're sort of deciding, okay, how are we going to do this? There's this thing which may be historical or it may be legendary that's in Herodotus, where it had like 10 Persians, one of which was Darius, uh, or maybe it was Cyrus, I forget. And they're saying, well, how shall we do this? And shall we have a king, or shall we have the 10 of us running it or something? Anyway, they end up deciding that one of them will be the king, and the others will be like high up nobles and so on. But that's the rare exception. Once there is a king, you don't have any further discussions of that nature. The king is the king, and the king will designate his child or whoever he wants, his brother or something, to be his successor, etc. And the only exception of that is that there's some conspiracy that says, we don't like this guy, let's kill him. And they kill the king, or they try to kill the king. And then the next day they come out of the palace and they say, oh, the king's had a terrible accident. And anybody got any questions about that? Okay, I'm glad that everybody understands that. From now on, I'm the new king, and so on. Or if it's a failed one, it's also beyond discussion. The regular king comes out and says, you may have heard rumors about something, but that was just a bunch of little nonsense. You can completely ignore that. So, somebody over there had a terrible accident. We're sorry about that. Anyway, things are going on as they always have gone on. So that's the alternative to Greece. Everywhere else in the civilized countries. But the shared power in the Greek communities was limited to spending a social life whose production remained the separate and static domain of the servile class. He uses that term. That includes slaves as well as poor laborers. The only people who lived were those who did not work. The divisions among the Greek communities and their struggles to exploit foreign cities were the externalized expression of the internal principle of separation on which each of them was based. Although Greece had dreamed of universal history, it did not succeed in unifying itself in the face of foreign invasion, or even in unifying the calendars of its independent city-states. Historical time became conscious in Greece, but it was not yet conscious of itself. The disappearance of the particular conditions that had fostered the Greek communities brought about a regression of Western historical thought, but it did not lead to a restoration of the old mythic structures. The clashes of the Mediterranean peoples and the rise and fall of the Roman state gave rise instead to semi-historical religions, which became a new armor for separate power and basic components of a new consciousness of time. And those semi-historical religions, of course, were Christianity and Islam. To a certain extent, Judaism was behind them, and it had also a sort of historical thing, but it was those two new ones who introduced a dynamism about we are going out and changing the world to accord with this. That's what's this next thesis. The monotheistic religions were a compromise between myth and history, between the cyclical time that still governed the sphere of production and the irreversible time that was the theater of conflicts and regroupings among different peoples. The religions that evolved out of Judaism were abstract, universal acknowledgments of an irreversible time that had become democratized and open to all, but only in the realm of illusion. The time is totally oriented toward a single final event. The kingdom of God is coming soon. These religions were rooted in the soil of history, but they remained radically opposed to history. The semi-historical religions established a qualitative point of departure in time, the birth of Christ or the flight of Mohammed. But their irreversible time, introducing an accumulation that would take the form of conquest in Islam, you conquer more and more things, or of increasing capital in Reformation Christianity, is inverted in religious thought and becomes a sort of countdown, waiting for time to run out before the last judgment and the advent of the other true world, the eternal world. Eternity has emerged from cyclical time as something beyond it. It is also the element that restrains the irreversible time, suppressing history within history by positioning itself on the other side of irreversible time as a pure point into which cyclical time returns and disappears. Bossuet, the bishop of Louis the 14th's era, Bossuet will still say, by way of time which passes, we enter eternity which does not pass. So I think I'll stop there for other questions and comments. Let's see, let me check here in the okay. No, I see a few things in the chat, but unfortunately, Kim doesn't seem to be with us here. So look at that. So I'm going to continue.
Kim is with us.
Oh, Kim is with. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
I don't know if he can hear us, but I think he can.
Okay, good. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. The Middle Ages, an incomplete mythical world whose consummation lay outside itself, is the period when cyclical time, though still governing the major part of production, really begins to be undermined by history. An element of irreversible time is recognized in the successive stages of each individual's life. Life is seen as a one-way journey through a world whose meaning lies elsewhere. The pilgrim is the person who leaves cyclical time behind and actually becomes the traveler that everyone else is symbolically. Personal historical life still finds its fulfillment within the sphere of the ruling powers. In struggles waged by those powers, or in struggles over disputed power. But the ruler's irreversible time is now shared to an unlimited degree due to the general unity brought about by the oriented time of the Christian era, a world of armed faith, where the adventures of the masters revolve around fealty and disputes over who owes fealty to whom. Feudal society was born from the merging of, quote, the organizational structures of the conquering armies that developed in the process of conquest with the productive forces found in the conquered regions, unquote. That's from Marx and Engels, The German Ideology. And the factors contributing to the organization of those productive forces included the religious language in which they were expressed. Social domination was divided between the church and the state, the latter power being in turn subdivided in the complex relations of suzerainty and vassalage within and between rural domains and urban communities. This diversification of potential historical life reflected the gradual emergence, following the failure of that great official enterprise of the medieval world, the Crusades, in parenthesis, the emergence of the era's unnoticed innovation, the irreversible time that was silently undermining the society, the time experienced by the bourgeoisie in the production of commodities, in the foundation and expansion of cities, and in the commercial discovery of the planet. A practical experimentation that destroyed every mythical organization of the cosmos once and for all. And I'm going to read one more here, and then we can stop. Within the waning of the Middle Ages, with the waning of the Middle Ages, the irreversible time that had invaded society was experienced by a consciousness still attached to the old order as an obsession with death. This was the melancholy of a world passing away, the last world where the security of myth still counterbalanced history. And for this melancholy, all earthly things move inevitably toward decay. The great peasant revolts of Europe were also an attempt to respond to history, a history that was violently wresting the peasants from the patriarchal slumber that had been imposed by their feudal guardians. The millenarians' utopian aspiration of creating heaven on earth revived a dream that had been at the origin of the semi-historical religions, when the early Christian communities, like the Judaic Messianism from which they had sprung, responded to the troubles and misfortunes of their time by envisaging the imminent realization of the kingdom of God, thereby adding an element of unrest and subversion to ancient society. When Christianity reached the point of sharing power within the empire, it denounced whatever still remained of this hope as mere superstition. In other words, back in Jesus's day, the idea was that this was coming any day now. I mean, it was probably going to come in our lifetime, the coming of Christ, the return and so on. After centuries went by, they said, no, and people said, well, maybe it says, they said, no, forget about that, and he's going to come to this very anticlimactic conclusion that no, the kingdom of God is the Catholic Church. Yay, it's here. It denounced whatever remained of this as a mere superstition. This is what Augustine was doing when, in a formula that can be seen as the archetype of all modern ideological apologetics, he declared that the kingdom of God had in fact already come long ago, that it was nothing other than the established church. The social revolts of the millenarian peasantry naturally began by defining their goal as the overthrow of that church. But millenarianism developed in a historical world, not on the terrain of myth. Modern revolutionary hopes are not irrational continuations of the religious passion of millenarianism, as Norman Cohn thought he had demonstrated in The Pursuit of the Millennium. On the contrary, millenarianism, revolutionary class struggle speaking the language of religion for the last time was already a modern revolutionary tendency, a tendency that lacked only the consciousness that it was a purely historical movement. The millenarians were doomed to defeat because they were unable to recognize their revolution as their own undertaking. The millenarians, the fact that they hesitated to act until they had received some external sign of God's will, was an ideological corollary to the insurgent peasants' practice of following leaders from outside their own ranks. The peasant class could not attain a clear understanding of the workings of society or how to conduct its own struggle, because it lacked these conditions for unifying its action and consciousness. And because it lacked these conditions, it expressed its project and waged its wars with the imagery of an earthly paradise. So we can stop there, getting kind of near the end. So any questions or comments on those two theses? Mike, unmute yourself.
When I read that part, I was thinking about the Makhnovist revolt in Ukraine and how the anarchists basically were organized peasants looking for the immediate utopia of the anarchist idea. And I thought, well, I don't know. That's my comment. Sorry, my observation.
No, that's a very good observation. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. And after 1917, while the Bolsheviks took over in the cities and much of the country, there had been, and then there was civil war against the whites, the czarists and reactionaries and so on. There were various forces besides the Bolsheviks there, and one of them, the most significant, was the Nestor Makhno, or Makhnov, I don't know how it's pronounced, was this anarchist leader of a Ukrainian peasant army or militia, whatever you might want to call it, sort of comparable to Zapata in Mexico. Or Pancho Villa, that kind of thing. And in similar cases, you had basically a peasantry, because almost all the people were peasants, who had up till that time been, Orthodox. I mean, they'd just been the usual peasant thing at the bottom, and going along with whatever they were told to do. And then when the Tsar is overthrown, they kind of in Makhno managed to rally much of the peasantry of the Ukraine to fight the whites. And then at that time, they were allied with the Bolsheviks. They were both fighting the whites, the white armies. And then the Red Army, led by Trotsky, then stabbed Makhno in the back, despite their allowance, and destroyed most of their army, and Makhno went into exile. Anyway, it's a very interesting, books have been written about it, and it's interesting, just like the Zapata ones are, but it's in a very different, the medieval peasants, you can understand why this would happen, but the modern peasants in the Ukraine were no longer that naive. I mean, they knew there were other countries with other forms of political organization and social organization and so on.
I visited Makhno's little place where his ashes were. They're right next to Isadora Duncan's in Père Lachaise.
Right.
Shut up now.
Thank you. Dave Blake, unmute yourself.
Interesting story. It's brief about how Trotsky finally dealt with Makhno was they agreed to organize a central gathering of all the revolutionary forces for a big discussion in Moscow, and issued special passes to all the various revolutionary members who wanted to come to the conference. And then the Trotskyist, the communist guards were given instructions to round up anyone who had those passes.
Yeah. So some of the key people of Makhno's army, fortunately not Makhno himself, but were then arrested and probably either killed or stayed in jail. Peter.
It didn't go well for them.
Didn't go well for them, I'm sure.
Yeah, David, that sounds to me a lot like when Machiavelli's talking about what Cesare Borgia did to beat some of the elites in his time. He invited them all to a conference and then he just killed them at the dinner table. He just, he knew how to use power, but very brutally. Yeah, I think what's really interesting here is him kind of bringing in the bourgeoisie. I think it's in 137. And how they start to organize time differently. It's kind of very, very subtly brought in here, but he says that it was the irreversible time silently undermining the society. And when you think about it, I think this goes to Edward's point about the peasantry. They experience things that are happening, like you said, but it's like somebody dies, like maybe there's a group that invades, but the way that they live life doesn't change from century to century or, millennia to millennia. People still are doing the same things that their great grandfathers were, or grandmothers or whatever. And I think we could even till very recently see societies that were doing the same thing, wearing the same kinds of clothes, using the same kinds of techniques to fish or whatever. And I think what's interesting he's saying is that when there is like surplus being produced, eventually the rulers start to say, hey, we can change things for ourselves. You said like wars. And maybe they build monuments to themselves, right? So that, hey, now there's a pyramid here where there wasn't, and it's always going to exist, and it's going to be a tribute to me, right? In a way that history now exists because there's this big pyramid in Egypt or something, and people know that was built a while ago for this person, but it doesn't change their lives. But then what he's saying is that starts to change a little bit more as more and more surplus starts to get accumulated. People start to wake up and say, well, maybe we can change history. We have some capability to do it because we can, produce more stuff, and maybe the rulers are going to get more powerful and conquer more land. But then he says in 137, it's the bourgeoisie that start to really change things at the base, which is when time really starts to come into effect for everybody, when our lives or social lives start to change. Because up until then, people are still weaving things the way they were 1,000 years ago, but then we get the power loom and we get we get coal fire and everything that nobody really, steam power was like a toy to the Romans. And then all of a sudden, within like 100 years, the English are starting to use it to produce, textiles and all these crazy things and producing all this more stuff. And so this time starts to change in a way. I think that for the peasants, no matter, tribe invades, people get wiped out, they go on the way that they used to. Capitalism is doing something different here with time. And he's starting to tell us here, even in 137, that it's just really, really interesting that he's, starting to point this out.
Yeah. And it's interesting back, I think the name bourgeoisie originally comes from the word burg, just means a town. It just means a town dweller, but little by little that got to mean a person in the town that had capital. And it may have been on a rather small level, but they had extra money, let's put it this way, because they had been hiring people to, make shoes for them, and then they sold the shoes, made a profit. Or in the early days, often those people were merchants who made it in trade, like they would invest maybe jointly in a ship that would then go someplace at great risk, but if it got back, if it went down, then they're out of pocket, but if it got back, suddenly they're making 100 times what they sent, like they're because nobody else has been doing that yet. They've gone 1,000 miles away and they've come back with this new thing called silk or this new, whatever it might be. And they're able to sell that to the nobles or the kings or so on. and then make more money, build more ships. And
Yeah.
so little by little, that's already going on in the Middle Ages, even though we think, oh, that's the kings and the nobles are ruling. Well, yeah, but the kings and the nobles sometimes need money because and so they borrow money from these people who become bankers and et cetera. And so this is creeping along there before anybody ever heard of such a thing. They just thought, oh, those rich people in the town, that like back in Chaucer's era, those people exist, but they're at that point, they're just considered kind of characters. Like this was somebody who was rich. Well, how did they get rich? Well, they were kind of clever with manipulating, this or that. So if you've got the Canterbury Pilgrims, there's some people that are like beggar level, and then there's other people that are pretty rich, but they're all kind of riding together along the journey of life there, and they can tell their different stories. But you see already that there's this differentiation in there where certain people are rich enough that they can have other stuff and they can invest, and then they end up out, little by little as the centuries go by. Some of them end up marrying into the nobility because they're so rich, and there's some of the nobles are poor and they sort of make a compromise. Well, you marry me and then you can be you too
And they
can
get
be
it not
noble and I
not
can have all your wealth.
not from like blood or like all that historical
Yeah.
stuff, like the kinship stuff, but it's something new, like you're saying. Like
Yeah.
it's oh, they've gone out and they've gotten this silk from where? China,
Yeah.
and made the money. Yeah.
Yeah, well, think of Marco Polo and his father and uncle. I mean, that's an extreme case because, I mean, they were gone like 20 years or something. It's
Yeah.
not like that's the way to make money, but the very existence of somebody like that indicates there were a lot of people that remained closer to home and still made a lot of money. They just sailed to Turkey or something and then came back to Italy. But so anyway, that's how a lot of that was happening before we had a lot of the institutions and concepts that we do later on. And then as that happened more, the Middle Ages, where you get the Renaissance and the Reformation, and the Reformation really kicks that in because that's very bourgeois sort of thing. Maybe we would say, well, why is that? You wouldn't think automatically, but it just happened that the way it worked was that these merchant kind of mentality would be sort of annoyed at the church that's just glomming away all their stuff in the tithes and everything else, and so if somebody comes in and says, well, I've got a new idea. What is it, Mr. Luther? It's like, yeah, we're still Christians. That's undebatable. But these people in Rome, they've been corrupting the religion, and we're talking about a religion that just kind of pares it down to the bone a little bit more and isn't glommed off, on buying golden crowns for the Pope or something. And it's, oh, that sounds pretty good, the businessman can pay fewer taxes and
And charge interest on your loans.
yeah. So as a combination of those different things, this is what we'll be getting to when we come back to the remainder of this chapter next time. Dave.
I think lost in this a little bit is the fact that the ruling class as a whole, though they are aware at some level of their self-interest, is also taken in by religion and the currents of the day to a great degree, and also do some incredibly stupid things against their own self-interest in following that. I mean, I forget who said it, but somebody once said that we tend to forget that the ruling class has lots of divisions within it, and we're crazy not to take advantage of it.
Thank you. John Solt.
Yes, I wanted to mention that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Oops. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this concept of cyclical time maybe is a little more abstract for Westerners, and it's only like the agricultural cycle that determines it. But actually in East Asia, especially in Japan, and Debord mentions dynasties, throughout history, they have had cyclical time as something that actually goes back to zero and reboots. So every time you have a new emperor in Japan, it goes back to zero. And now we are in the 6th year of Reiwa, which is the emperor now. And this always goes through time. And you have over the centuries, sometimes they'll have like an earthquake or typhoon or something that creates some kind of natural disaster. And then they'll say, okay, we're back to zero. And the emperor says, we reboot and we go to zero for that year. So you constantly have these cyclical reboots going on throughout history. And only in the Meiji period in 1867, when the new period, the West came in, and, you know, they went then with the Christian time, and that was linear time. And then during World War II, they said, fuck the West. Why should we go with their time? They're our enemy. So they went back to mythical time, but in a linear way. And they said Emperor Jimmu, 660 BC. And so they started recounting, and they changed the whole number system during the war. So for example, a diary that came out in 1945 was in the year 2605, which is also the 20th year of Hirohito, called Showa. And even now, when Japanese talk about like 1920s, they say early Showa period, which is Hirohito's reign. So everyone thinks in reign terms and back to zero all the time. So for people like that, the linear thing is kind of parallel to the cyclical one. And whereas for the Westerners, I think from Christ's time, they only think linear, more or less. And Debord is trying to talk about the Middle Ages, but actually, I think what he's pointing to is very concrete and makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, John. Kim.
Hi, I wanted to make one comment. It's tangential to what Peter and John were talking about agriculture, because in 127, Debord says, the transition from pastoral nomadism to sedentary agriculture marks the end of an idle and contentless freedom and the beginning of labor. And in my reading of various anthropological texts, agriculture is sometimes considered to be a significant revolution in the history of humanity, in that that's when class structure occurred and surplus occurred. But it's interesting that in 131, he talks about writing. Writing is the ruler's weapon, because also in my reading of anthropological text, contrary to what I just stated about agriculture, I sometimes see statements like the real problem that occurred in the history of humanity was the invention of language. So I don't know if they're both problems or one's more significant than the other, but I thought it was interesting that Debord talks about agriculture, talks about writing, not specifically language, but I guess we can.
He's talking about language too. He says, in writing, language attains its complete independence as a mediation between consciousnesses.
So we can ponder which one's more harmful.
Well, again, I want to stress that it's not like picking this and saying this is bad and that's even worse, or this was the origin of, a lot of times, if you look closer, I mean, just because, in fact, agriculture may have represented a shift in how people operated, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with agriculture. That's just, I mean, if you want to look at it in a certain way, it's a different way to make food, to make more food more consistently and securely. So obviously in itself, there's nothing wrong with that. It's like once that happens, maybe it kicks in as a side effect, the fact that some people are going to be working in the fields and somebody else will have come up with the idea like, I own this field. The gods gave this to me, or so, and so maybe that's a kind of natural development of that, but that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with agriculture as such. And again, because any ruling class is going to use language, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with language. I mean, obviously, we would prefer not to go back. I certainly would not want to go back without language. There's a lot of things like, that we do with language that are, they're interesting and fulfilling and so on like that. They have lots of possibilities, but it's just like, obviously, once you have language, then you can lie, you can fool people, whereas an animal maybe is not going to be fooled because they're just looking at what you do or what you smell like or something. I would just question this thing like, well, is he saying that this is the worst thing or this is the worst? He's not. There are people around who do that, and that's called ideology. I mean, there's people who say, oh, agriculture, that's the beginning of the, it's this very simplistic kind of notion like, oh, if that was the beginning of all this, then we need to go back and be hunter-gatherers, which is completely silly. I mean, even if it were possible, which it is not, obviously we couldn't do that without billions of people dying, and by the same token, are we going to live without language? Well, let's just look at how we use language and there's other factors going on there. And you can say the same thing about science or about the arts or all these others. So do try to note, like, Debord is using these languages, these words or concepts for what he can use them for, what we can use them for. So obviously we can say, okay, writing, chronicle, democracy, history, time, we've got these different things and they're going through different games with each other, different overlappings and conflicts and transformations and so on. So the thing is not to arrive at some conclusion that some vague kind of thing is the problem, when the problem is some very complex, conjunctures of different things. I mean, we can occasionally arrive at a conclusion, like after we've read chapter 4 of this book, or various other experiences, we could arrive at a conclusion that Stalinism is really bad, that is not the way to go. But that's not flippantly saying, oh, just because of that. And that doesn't even mean that a Stalinist can't do good things or be a nice, person or something like that. It's just, we can pin it down and say, this thing has shown that it's completely, it's hardly distinguishable from fascism or something like that. Whereas other things are a little more iffy. We can say, okay, the unions are like this, or certain political things are like this, but there's more of wiggle room in there. In another sense, you can say politics is bullshit, and in another sentence, you can say revolutionary politics means blah, blah, blah. Anyway, thank you for bringing that up, and I'm glad you're able to, you got your computer working. Or
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, we've run over some time here, but thanks for your good questions and comments. And I'm going to be pretty busy tomorrow, so I may not get the email out till tomorrow evening or Tuesday morning or something like that. But basically, we will just be continuing to read this chapter and going into the, there's a very short chapter called Spectacular Time that comes after it. So we'll try to read those two. So thank you for that. And I'll see you 2 weeks from now for that, and hope to see several of you who are in the literary group a week from now.
Great.
Thanks,
Thanks a
Ken.
lot. Thank you,
Thanks,
Ken.
Ken.
Thank you.
Bye, Ken. Night.
Here we go. 3, 2, 1.